Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 6 on Public Opinion, Political Socialization, and the Media. So we'll be covering what public opinion actually means, how you form it through political socialization and some demographic factors that can potentially contribute, and how public opinion is measured. This is mainly through opinion polls. So we'll talk about how they do it, what are the difficulties, what do the results mean, and the really important difference between correlation and causation. So kind of basically, public opinion is the aggregate or average of the of the individual attitudes or beliefs shared by some portion of the adult population, right? Is sort of the kind of general idea or general opinion that the adult population of a country may have, right? A consensus means that there's general agreement on an issue, and of course a divided opinion means that there's an opinion that's divided, right? Polarized between two opposing positions. So that's sort of the key words of the chapter here, really important. Make sure we're all on the same page. Now, in terms of forming public opinion, your book highlights this idea of political socialization. What is political socialization? Well, we know what socialization means, right? It's how you sort of pick up beliefs and values, right? You can be socialized to believe something, right, or to have some sort of value. Well, this is the same thing with political. The same thing can happen in political socialization, right? You can pick up political beliefs or political values in a couple different ways, and these generally happen in the same way that you would sort of have regular socialization or non-political socialization. So your family, of course, affects your political beliefs or values, right? How you were raised definitely affects this. Education plays a huge role, right? The school itself, your actual environment. Thinking about your peers, your friends play a huge role in this, right? Your book actually says that political attitudes are more likely shaped by peer groups, and especially when those peer groups are directly involved in political activities, which I guess makes sense. I mean, you could kind of argue it both ways. Sometimes the things that are most political or the things that are most influential or the things that we don't even realize are political. So something to think about. Our political beliefs are also influenced by opinion leaders, right? So at the formal level, you have presidents or lobbyists, news commentators, or informally by teachers at school or other family members or friends, right? Basically anyone who we're closely associated with or someone that we hold in high regard. You tend to listen to someone that you respect and are influenced by people that you are close to. And of course, this can actually be consciously or subconsciously. The media, unsurprisingly, plays a role. This is anything from TV, newspapers, radio, social media, etc. The media informs the public about issues or events, and so it's said to have an agenda effect, right? The media in some ways sets the agenda because it covers certain issues and not others. It has the power to call attention to some things and allow other things, sometimes important things, to go by the wayside. There's a lot of power there, right? Opinion leaders and the media can sometimes combine too, and one way we see this is through celebrities participating in politics, right? Either commenting on different political issues through their Twitters or Facebooks, or even running for different offices. So of course there are some positives and negatives, right? We can consider. Maybe some negatives. Do these people understand the plight of quote-unquote normal people, right? Or do they have so much money and influence that they're just sort of out of the loop? Is it a crime for them not to be involved, right? They have so much influence, so is it wrong for them not to use their position for good, right? To highlight important issues. Of course, celebrities have as much right as anyone else to speak their minds, but it is kind of important that they realize their influence and their visibility. Of course, it can be a double-edged sword, right? It can be so useful to highlighting, issues that need to be highlighted, like, poverty or discrimination. But I guess we also have to question the fact that just because they're celebrities doesn't mean that they're necessarily qualified to speak on these issues, and that sometimes having such a soapbox and such a visible space could actually be kind of dangerous, right? Because they're not qualified necessarily to talk about medical issues, for example, right? So it's kind of dangerous. Definitely sort of a split opinion there. Okay, so political socialization, right? There's so many ways that we can be socialized politically, and one of these ways is also political events. Political events affect political socialization, and they can even shape the attitudes of entire generations. This is called the generational effect or the cohort effect. And it's the effect of the events of a particular time on the political opinions of those who came of age at that time. So coming of age is like teens to 20s, right? When you become socially or politically aware. So for instance, the Depression era people, they're born around this time. They came to age during the Depression, right? Okay, so they're born in the 1900s. The Depression, the Great Depression, starts in the late 1920s and 1930s. So thinking about these people, how do you think living during the Great Depression would affect their spending habits or their attitudes towards economics? Unsurprisingly, these Depression-era individuals, tend to be conservative, right? They're compulsive savers, they maintain low debt, and they use more secure financial products like CDs versus stocks. They also fought during World War II. They were World War II started in 1939 and went to 1945. We got involved a little bit towards the end of it, right? So they would be around their 20s and 30s, right? How would this affect their view towards politics? Well, the Depression-era individuals tend to feel a responsibility to leave a legacy to their children. They tend to be patriotic, oriented towards work before pleasure. They have respect for authority and have a sense of moral obligation. The silent generation was born in the mid-1920s to 1940s. They came to age around the 1950s. They actually fought, They fought in the Korean War, which is 1950 to 1953. A lot of civil rights leaders were born during this time, like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Robert Kennedy, Gloria Steinem. So you can imagine these people. Then you have the first segment of baby boomers. They were born from 1945, so after World War II, to 1954. And they're called baby boomers because there was a huge increase of children after the war. They came to age in the 1960s to the 1970s. And they witnessed President Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassinations and the civil rights movements and the Vietnam War. The boomers they protested the war. How do you think this affected their politics? The Vietnam War was not very popular. They were very vocal. They organized. They are very political. They tend to lean to the left. They're actually more democrats in terms of not like Democratic, but Democrats versus Republicans. So these people tend to be Democrats more so than the silent generation and the Depression era. They are the hippies, the flower children, the peace movements of the 1960s and 70s, right? The ones that are demonstrating against the Vietnam War. We have a lovely picture right here of the hippie flower children, peace movement people. Skipping ahead a little bit to Generation X, these people were born between the mid-60s to the 80s. They came to age in the late 1980s and the mid-1990s. And they're described as a generation whose worldview is based on change, on the need to combat corruption, dictatorships, abuse, AIDS, a generation in search of human dignity and individual freedom. It was a very tumultuous time. The 1980s and the 90s, I guess, there's a lot of change, a lot of big highs, low lows, financially a lot of change, variability, there's low job security. These Generation Xers are the ones that dealt the worst with the financial crash in 2008, right? They were in their 30s. How do you think this affects their politics? They do tend to be sort of in between. They're like the tweener generation. They're actually called the middle child. They're between two different, very feisty generations, the boomers and the millennials. So they tend to be very consistent and sort of hardworking. They tend to be forgotten about. Poor Generation Xers, they're the middle children. Thinking about the Generation Y or the millennials, this spans a really wide group, and I think that this should actually be split, especially technologically speaking. There was a lot of changes in the late 90s and early 2000s in terms of, the access to the internet and stuff and computers, but Generation Y members tend to be very racially and ethnically diverse. Thinking about the rapid expansion of cable TV channels, satellite radio, the internet, e-zines, other media, technology just exploded for this generation, right? So how do you think this affects their politics? You have the world at your fingertips at your computer, right? Of course, for this generation, like I said, there's a lot of diversity, right? There's a lot of openness. As we'll see in a couple of slides, the Generation Y or the millennials tend to be more, they tend to be Democrat. They tend to be liberal and open-minded, have really wide perspectives when it comes to the world. Besides technology, there's also been new threats to security coming from terrorism. Thinking about, 2001. If you're born in the 80s and 90s, you're now in your late 20s and 30s, or mid, I guess, if you're from 94. But many people remember September 11th, right? And the changes that came and the issues that arose from terrorism, right? So that also affects this generation's view of the world, of security, of politics, of certain policies related to security. Then we have Generation Z, coming of age sort of now-ish and in the future. We don't know a ton about this generation yet, but there is, of course, incredible and unprecedented levels of technology for this generation, more so than any other. I'm probably a little bit older than you, but I remember a time before computers and before cell phones. This generation would be basically born with a cell phone in their hand, right? Like, just a completely different relationship with technology. Generation Z kids will grow up with a very highly sophisticated media and computer environment. So they're going to actually be probably more internet savvy than their Generation Y millennial forerunners. So thinking about how that may affect their politics, maybe they're going to be even more liberal, thinking about having access to so much information. They could go the other direction too. We don't know a ton about Generation Z, so it'll be interesting to see how things will move and how things will happen. So this is a survey done asking each of the generations what makes their generation unique. So you have the millennials pretty much talking a lot about technology, the Generation Xers talking a little bit about technology, but a lot about work ethics. Of course, everyone thinks they're smarter. The boomers, they have they highlight their good work ethic, that they're respectful, that they have values. You have the silent generation talking a lot about the Great Depression and World War II, about honesty. They're actually the only ones that talked about honesty. interesting, I think. Interesting structural differences. This is party identification in terms of generations. So which generation leans, or what percentage of each generation leans Democrat or Republican. So you have a lot of millennials leaning Democratic. There's about, in terms of all Americans, sort of in the aggregate, there's about almost an even split. But you see millennials, 53 to 35, leaning Democratic, and then sort of an even split with the rest. So some things to consider. We talked a little bit about technology, right? And having so much information at your fingertips, maybe that sort of makes you have a more open perspective, to be a little bit more liberal. They have done some studies that show, having a lot of information does sort of make your perspectives wider, and it does seem to have a correlation in terms of less conservatism and more openness. Thinking about the influence of other demographic factors, demographic characteristics like education, income, religious denomination are shown to be strongly correlated with political party preferences and political ideologies. Education, as your book explains, used to be correlated with voting Republican. So if you had a college education back in the day, you would be associated with being a Republican. Now, individuals with higher education, and this includes postgraduate education, are primarily Democrats. Income level is also a strong predictor of economic liberalism or conservatism. People with lower incomes tend to favor government intervention into the economy, which I guess is unsurprising. If they need it, that's what they like. People tend to favor stuff that helps them. Those who are richer tend to want to keep their money, right? So they tend to be opposed to social benefits for the poor. So economically speaking, conservatives tend to be conservative with their money and economic policies. And liberals tend to be liberal economically, or more open to government spending on social benefits and entitlements. What's interesting is that this relationship is different when it comes to social values or issues like gay marriage or reproductive rights. Upper class voters tend to be more culturally liberal than poorer voters. So people in lower socioeconomic backgrounds actually tend to be more culturally conservative. I thought that was kind of interesting. So in terms of income, it's kind of what you would expect. But when it comes to being socially liberal or conservative, people with lower incomes tend to be more socially conservative. So people that are poor, there's a higher connection with them being, let's say, anti-gay marriage. Now, of course, these relationships don't hold 100% of the time. There are a ton of Republicans who have high incomes, a lot of Democrats who are on the lower socioeconomic totem pole. There's also highly educated, wealthy Democrats, right? Obviously, these in some ways are kind of stereotyping, and there are significant limitations whenever you try to put people in boxes. Religion tends to play a role. Your textbook talks about church going. They say it, they call it degree of religious commitment, and measuring how conservative people are. Whether you're evangelical, fundamentalist, to connect how conservative people are in social issues. So if you go to church, right, you tend to be less inclined to support gay rights, for example. That's how they would measure degree of religious commitment, right? Church attendance. Of course, this is sort of difficult too. How do you measure commitment to, religion? Is it just through church attendance? Not great. Again, not only are these sort of stereotypes, they're also sort of limiting in terms of the actual measurement. For instance, actually, I'll just move on from there. Geographic region plays a role. whether you live in a rural or urban environment is said to dictate your political views. So there's like this north-south divide kind of. If you live in a rural southern area, you tend to be conservative. If you live in a northern urban area, you tend to be more liberal. Of course, environment does affect your political socialization, like we talked about. But does it necessarily dictate your politics? I like to sort of see, the ability for people to choose their own ways, right? I mean, of course, there are a ton of, I'm sure, liberal people living in the South and really conservative people living in the North. So again, sort of a stereotyping, like a limiting stereotyping. I highlighted race and ethnicity and gender. These are two demographic factors that I hesitate to include. There's just way too much variation in the population to say that all women vote a certain way or that all Hispanics or all African Americans tend to vote a certain way. But I guess if you want to say that Hispanics or women demonstrate support for certain policies, that may be an intuitive argument. So let's say if you're an immigrant, if you have some sort of immigrant background, or let's say your parents came from Mexico or Poland, like my parents, or Germany or Zimbabwe, you would assume that I would assume that you would be pro-immigration, right? That you would support a pathway to citizenship for people who are in a similar boat as you, right? Similarly for women, right? Women are the only ones with reproductive capabilities to bear children, right? I would assume that they would be interested in supporting policies that would help them limit or control these capabilities, or keep institutions open that provide women's health care, right? Like Planned Parenthood, which actually only has 3% of its stuff going to abortion. 97% of what they do in Planned Parenthood is education, STD testing, sort of basic gynecological, what's it called? Appointments, right? Doing pap smears and doing sort of regular work. In many low-income neighborhoods, too, Planned Parenthood is the only place that offers breast exams, cancer screenings, gynecological exams that you need to do annually. Again, what I mentioned earlier, only 3% of what they do is abortion services. But so that is just something. I mean, I guess you can kind of assume some things that are related to people's backgrounds, but I would hesitate to make blanket statements based on someone's gender or their race. Although what is interesting is that there is research that shows women and men track one another pretty closely in views about abortion. There isn't a sort of gender gap there. Because of the wage gap, as we learned, women, and especially women of color, tend to be poorer. And this is exacerbated if these women have children. Obviously, if you have children, there's even less money to go around, right? So understanding that women are the majority of the impoverished, the majority of single parents, and the majority of the old, women live longer than men. This is something that scholars call the feminization of poverty, right? So they tend to support welfare and other safety nets. So, for instance, when Reagan in 1980 proposed cuts to welfare, he alienated women, right? They didn't support this. And women's approval of Reagan and his policies were thus lower than men's. Women are consistently higher supporters of Democrats. So I just wanted to highlight that because people don't vote for stuff. They don't vote for handouts. That's sort of denigrating people's identities and their realities, right? The reality of their situations. People do vote in their interests, though, right? It'd be counterintuitive not to do so. So again, sort of highlighting the differences between just blanket statements made on identity and statements made in terms of the reality of statistics, right? Women tend to be poorer. They tend to live longer, right? Those kind of things. So yeah, as a woman, I wouldn't be in favor of cutting Social Security because that's going to affect my life personally, right? It's not about handouts, it's about being intelligent. So just something to sort of consider there. All right, let's talk about measuring opinion polls. What is an opinion poll? Well, it's a survey of the public's opinions or views on something, right? It's from a particular sample of people. And the idea is that if you do it right, a randomly selected small sample of the population can actually represent the attitudes, the opinions, or projected behavior of all of the people from which the sample is taken. So if you do an opinion poll of a small random sample of people, you can assume that that's the case for everyone in the state or everyone in the country, of course with some limitations. Sampling refers to the amount of people that are asked. Let's say you need to figure out how the US population feels about the president. Of course, you're not going to ask every single person in the country, so you take a sample of people. And to actually have this smaller group of people represent the entire population, you have to do a specific kind of sampling. First of all, it has to be random. Every person in the entire country should have an equal chance of being sampled. If it's not random, it won't be representative of the whole, since of course you're just cherry picking people, right? The book mentions an early opinion poll by the magazine Literary Digest. The magazine had done polls for 20 years during the early 20th century, and they were actually pretty accurate, about 70% accurate. But in 1936, they did a poll and predicted that the Republican presidential candidate Alfred Landon would beat Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt in the race. And they were totally wrong. How did this happen? Let's think about sampling. Well, who did they ask in this poll? Their readers, right? Were their readers representative of the whole country? No, they were actually a lot wealthier. This was the Great Depression, right? It's 1936. If you had money for magazines, you were rich. Most people were starving or, totally unemployed and really, really struggling. So since the readers of this digest were a really small subset of the US population, they did not accurately represent everybody, right? So this was an issue in sampling. It was not random. It was totally cherry picking, right? So you need random sampling in opinions for them to be even close to being accurate, right? And this is done by choosing randomly, right? Because opinion polls are not a perfect science, you do have what's called sampling error. If you think about the sample result and compare that to the population result, it's obviously not going to be exactly the same. It'll be close, hopefully, if you've done it if you've done it well, but there will be what is called the margin of error. So let's say we have someone running for governor and they are polling 3 points ahead of their opponent. They're doing well, right? But there's a margin of error of 3 points. Is it a close race? Yes, potentially. If you have a margin of error of 3 points and the person is ahead by 3 points, the race actually could be neck and neck, right? You have to think about sort of removing, or I guess you could say removing the margin of error from the difference, and see how close it is. If the person is up by 20 points, right? Let's say this one candidate is up 20 points against her opponent, and the margin of error is 3 points. She's doing pretty well, right? Even if we are wrong by 3 points, she is still has a pretty healthy lead, right? Even if you're wrong by 3 points and she's up by 17 points, right? Pretty good, right? Why is there a margin of error? Well, it could be anything from crappy sampling. Maybe the poll didn't reach as many different households as it wanted to. Maybe there's a problem with the questions themselves. A poor questionnaire design could lead to wonky results. It could be a million different reasons, right? But it tends to be that the more people you poll, the more accurate the polls tend to be. So actually, let's consider some of the difficulties of accurate results. Sampling by itself is already hard. People tend to not answer calls, right, or refuse to answer. So this affects the randomness of sampling, right? Pollsters actually used to go door to door and interview people. Very difficult to do today. So how would you contact people? By phone? Do most people have landlines? Not really. And robocalls, those sort of automated calls, are not allowed to contact cell phones. So you have this sort of issue, right? First, you have non-response, people just not wanting to answer. You have issues of coverage, right? Even just trying to actually contact people. Things are kind of different technologically today than they were back then. Then you also have what's called response bias. Opinion polls can be affected by this. Let's say there is a question or a series of questions that are really controversial. People might be sort of unwilling to admit to unpopular attitudes, right? Does anyone want to just tell someone that or just kind of admit to being sexist or racist? Not really. People tend to lie on polls. So not all the time, but when something seems kind of like, ugh, I can't really tell the person my honest answer. A classic example of this was when Tom Bradley was running for mayor. He was the first African American mayor of LA, and he ran against a white candidate, George Decugian, for governor, right? Okay, so Tom Bradley, first African American mayor of LA, running against a white guy for governor in 1982. This is in California. Based on opinion surveys, Bradley, the African American guy, was a shoo-in. My God, he had a double-digit lead in the polls. They thought he's for sure going to win. It's not even a question. Then election day approaches, and guess who won? The white guy, George Decugian. How? Everyone was so surprised. Bradley polled so much higher, right? So many more people claimed that they were going to vote for him. What happened? Well, what researchers found is what is now known as the Bradley effect. That people may say different things in polls, as to not appear racist or sexist or whatever, to have to admit to something that is considered in society to be not a great thing, right? So we have response biases. We have actual difficulties in the question phrasing or the structure. For instance, if you had a question like this, it's sort of setting you up, right? Do you favor candidate A's tax plan, which gives most of its benefits to rich people, or candidate B's tax plan, which gives more to real Americans like you and me? Of course, this is a very obvious example, but this is sort of a leading question, right? It's sort of, when you read this, you're like, oh, well, of course I'm going to pick candidate B's tax plan. That's going to give me money. I'm a real American, not like those rich people, right? So phrasing is important. You don't want to sort of lead people to a certain view or opinion. Another example here, the question one, this version 1. President Bush failed the nation in his handling of the Iraq War. How do you approve of the job he is doing as president? Well, if you're already thinking about him as failing the nation in his handling, you're going to say, you're going to skew your consideration of the job he's doing now as kind of lower, right? But then if you have a question like this, President Bush saved the nation in his handling of the Iraq War. How do you approve the job he's doing as president? Of course, this is going to change the way you answer the question, right? If you're sort of led to believe that President Bush saved the nation in terms of the Iraq War, right? So we have non-response, we have coverage issues, we have response biases, and of course the question phrasing and structure, the framing effect, right? If you want an accurate public opinion, you want to sort of deal with these as best you can. Here are some examples of the impacts of question wording. So this is talking about abortion, right? Thinking about how question wording shapes the way people respond to surveys. So here we have, which of the following best represents your views about abortion? The choice on abortion should be left up to the woman and her doctor. Abortion should be legal only in cases in which pregnancy results from rape or incest, or when the life of the woman is at risk, or abortion should be illegal in all circumstances. the way this is framed, you're kind of, you know, leaning towards this, right? And that's what we see here, right? This kind of phrasing, left up to the woman and her doctor. You don't see that very often. Now let's think about this question. Which of these comes closest to your view? Abortion should be generally available to those who want it, or abortion should be available but under stricter limits than it is now, or abortion should not be permitted. The way that that's sort of set up is, oh, well, maybe we should have it, but we should have some stricter limits, because you don't have a lot of information here about what the limits currently are for abortion, right? I mean, you can argue several different ways, especially, now that we do have the poll results, but look at this skew, right? You have such a different skew of the results, right, based on these particular questions, right? I think we have another example here. What is your personal feeling about abortion? It should be permitted in all cases. It should be permitted but subject to greater restrictions than it is now. It should be permitted only in cases such as rape, incest, and to save the woman's life, or it should be only permitted to save the woman's life. Here you have more detail, right? So maybe people will be, thinking about, well, it should be permitted in these considerations. Many different ways, right, to look at this. You can sort of analyze it in many different ways. Then we have this poll from the Washington Post and ABC News. Do you think abortion should be legal in all cases, legal in most cases, illegal in most cases, or illegal in all cases? Most people say legal in most cases or illegal in most cases. You don't have a lot of information here, though, right? What cases? So giving maybe more information, you see a different smattering of the results. Giving less information, you have sort of a different one too, right? So the structure of the questions is important. Also, the structure of the questionnaire itself in terms of sequence, right? Let's say there's a long string of questions about unpopular issues supported by the president. And then they ask you, are you going to re-elect that president? Well, if you're reminded by all the negative ideas relating to that president, and then asked a question about the person's re-election, you might be more, likely to say you're not going to vote for the president, right? So the results are really just an estimate or a snapshot of political opinion. They don't predict the future, and they usually just give an approximate view of what voters thought at that time, right? People do change their minds, they change their opinions, and of course, if opinion polls were super accurate and could just predict election results, the elections, the candidates wouldn't be spending so much money campaigning, right? And if you're going to read some polls, let's say we're in an election year, so you may be reading some, here are our 5 tips on how to read them. As we know, the margin of error is the percentage that they can be wrong, right? Remember, they're not polling every single person in the country or the county or whatever it is, so there is some guessing involved, right? You are asking the sample, and so there is margin for error, and there's always some kind of margin of error, right? So again, if that's like a 3% margin of error or minus 3%, and the approval rating is 50%, the real approval rating is between 47 and 53%, right? There's a plus or minus kind of thing, right? And if there's a huge margin of error, not great. You don't want to read a poll that has a huge margin of error, because that means that the sample size was probably not large and it's not very accurate. Secondly, what is the timing of the poll? The closer it is to election day, the more accurate it is, right? People can change their minds, and we do see that. If the poll is 6 months out, let's say, and there's some news story that comes out about the candidate, or the candidate does poorly in a debate or something, people have a tendency to change their their minds, right? Thirdly, is thinking about the sample. Is the sample random, right? Random sample is the gold standard. If the people responding to the survey select themselves, or it's on a website or something, right? Maybe interesting to read, but not a super accurate picture of the entire public's opinion, right? Fourthly, this is really important too, how big is the sample size? If you're going to ask 3 people questions, obviously that is not accurate. If you're asking 300 or 3,000, right? Not as accurate. So be wary of polls that sample only a small number of people. The larger, the better. And lastly, all polls have some kind of biases. They are imperfect, right? So if you want to get a really accurate picture of the public's opinion on something, look at a range of polls, okay? And take out some of the ones that have a really extreme finding. Look at the average of what you see, because that is most likely the accurate picture. Now, to finish up here, I just wanted to highlight the difference between correlation and causation. It's an important thing to consider when we're looking at statistical stuff. So correlation means that the two things are somehow related. There is some kind of relationship. Causation means that the action is actually being caused by something. Let me give you an example. This graph shows correlation. The number of pirates correlated with global warming. So here, the x-axis, we see the number of pirates, right, decreasing over time. Okay, in 1820 there was a pretty sizable population of pirates. Nowadays, not so much. And on the y-axis here, we see the global average temperature. So the temperature rising, right? So this graph basically shows as the number of pirates decrease, the average global temperature goes up, right? We have the number of pirates here getting smaller, smaller, smaller. As we look here, look, the global average temperature has actually increased to about 16 degrees. This means that pirates kept global warming from happening, or pirates caused global warming. No. This is an example of correlation, not causation. These two things have a relationship, but one does not cause the other. So, other examples. The number of people who drowned by falling into a pool correlates with films that Nicolas Cage has appeared in. Pretty closely, actually. Now, does this mean that people are drowning in pools somehow caused by Nick Cage films? No. Correlates, right? Some kind of relationship, but not causation. Another one. As you can see here, the per capita cheese consumption actually correlates with the number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. Correlation, but not causation. Cheese has nothing to do with bed sheet tanglings. Well, it may, but not to this degree, right? The per capita consumption of mozzarella cheese correlates with civil engineering doctorates awarded. I don't think these civil engineering doctorates are being awarded based on cheese or anything, right? We see, again, a relationship, but not a causation. And lastly, the letters in the winning word of this National Spelling Bee correlates with number of people killed by venomous spiders. It's pretty interesting, but it is totally not causation, right? The spelling bee winning word has nothing to do with the number of people killed by venomous spiders. So, again, correlation does not mean causation. Some things could be related and they could have literally nothing to do with one another as in terms of causation, right? So overall, we do need to be aware of the biases and the shortcomings of statistical work because numbers can lie. I will leave you here. As always, any questions or comments, please don't hesitate.